BCB and IBEST are really happy to have Julia Kelleher with us today to lead a Transgender 101 presentation. Julia is the director of the LGBTQA office here at UI. And Julia, I'll just turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks y'all for having me. My name is Julia, as Luke introduced. I'm the director of the LGBTQA office and a mediocre biology student at BEST. And so I use she, her pronouns. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to provide you with some best tips and practices for working with those who self-identify as transgender. And I'm going to provide you with some information on more about transgender identity. And this presentation is going to cover kind of introductory level topics when it comes to trans identities. But hopefully you will all get something out of this and provide you with some information that you maybe didn't know before going into it. I got my chat open up here on my one screen. I got PowerPoint, should be shared on the other. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to either unmute and ask me a question or say something, or ask it in the chat. I love interaction, especially over Zoom, because sometimes you feel like you're just talking into like my computer monitor for an hour and a half or something, and it gets a little hard sometimes. Some quick ground rules before we get started, so we're all in the same way. Well, I did share kind of a silly story about me not doing well in biology. I am an educator, and part of my job is working within education, but also too, I am a doctoral student in education, focusing on higher education and leadership. So when it coming to like pedagogy and epistemology of understanding how we learn, I definitely feel that learning comes when we feel uncomfortable. And I know that's kind of counterintuitive to what I have on the screen, which is take these risks as you feel comfortable. But that, but the reality is that when we feel like kind of that mildly uncomfortableness, that's when we learn the most. Like I don't feel like I don't learn anything when I don't have any investment in it or any emotional investment in it. So it's important to kind of think about that. So I really want to encourage you all to take those participate, take these risks as you feel comfortable. And then we all have a mutual respect. I'm not a serious presenter. I love to crack jokes and tell mildly embarrassing stories about myself. And so hopefully we have lots of respect for me as a presenter and you all as participants, and we can have a very respectful conversation today. Listen openly, second guess any assumptions. None of us are bias free. I identify as part of the transgender community. I've done this work in this field as a graduate student and a professional for over 12 years now. And I still have biases and misconceptions and thoughts that make, sometimes I have to go like, where the heck did that come from? And that's okay. That's just all part of learning. It's that uncomfortability with that. So listen openly, second guess these assumptions you may have, particularly when talking about gender, because gender is such a ingrained, vital, socialized part of our society. It's put into, it makes up everything we do in our world. So it can be really hard if we're not, I mean, we haven't had any exposure to these topics, or these are new topics that we're exploring ourselves. Confidentiality, I know this is being recorded, so just be aware of that it's going to go on the internet. I can't ensure complete confidentiality of this, but we can try to have, I don't out anyone if I talk stories about what's with my students, no identifying information, using gender neutral pronouns, not using any names. We want to make sure that we respect people's abilities to tell their own story, and respect their not outing anybody. Education, we're all here to grow, learn, and share, so hopefully you learned something today. Speak honestly about issues, not people. Like I said, I'm part of the community. A lot of my close friends and family are part of the community. And so for me, it's not just about let's debate about identities. This is my life. And so we want to speak honestly, and we want to talk about the identities rather than the people attached to those identities. And finally, this is a space, hopefully this is a safe space for you all, or at very least a brave space. And as you can tell on the side, it spells process in rainbow. And so what that means is that even though this is in the past has been called like an ally training. I don't necessarily consider it to be an ally training, because you can't train people to be allies. Allies are self-appointed identifiers. Like I'm an ally to other communities. That's part of my identity. But really, what reality is this is an advocacy training. What we're trying to do today, I'm trying to train people to be better advocates for a group of students and a group of employees and people around our campus who don't usually have the space and the emotional ability, like the emotional bandwidth to do this, to advocate for folks and with a topic that is so highly politicized and also highly targeted to highly like personalized, can be very hard to talk about. So I think it's important to understand that whether this is the first time you're talking about these topics, or you're part of the community, or you consider yourself an ally to the community, it's important that we all are here in all steps of the process. And I try to think about that as we go through the presentation. And please, at any time, feel free if you have any questions, let me know. So to begin, why do we need to talk specifically about transgender identities? And there's kind of a little bit of pop sociology, I'm going to call it. It's more, I read it like on a Huffington Post article or whatever. It's not like a scientific, like peer-reviewed theory, but they call it like the modern family effect. And so what that means is that our society has a pretty good grasp of sexual orientation. We understand queer folks, we understand gay folks, bisexual, mostly pansexual, depending on the generation and exposure. We understand people who are in, who either identify as somewhere in different, not heterosexual, or in a same-sex or queer relationship. We tend to get that. They call it the modern family effect because of that show that ran on ABC for so many years that had Cam and, oh gosh, I don't remember the guys. I'd only seen like a season of it. Cam and Mitchell, I think their names were, who were a same-sex couple. And then like Ellen, before her show got canceled because of controversy, like having Ellen on television. I know my coming out story was definitely, my family was definitely more easier to understand queer people because of Ellen, like those kinds of things. So that's different than trans identity. So trans identity is kind of a whole different type of understanding of these different identities. And so why we need to talk about it is, as this statistic comes actually from a source from 2011, the statistic on the left about attempted suicide. And that source hasn't been updated. The statistics haven't been updated, but the reality is that it's still pretty close to the actual percentages that is listed on this graphic. And so what it says is that about 41% of transgender and gender nonconforming or non-binary folks, to modernize the language, have attempted suicide. And that's compared to 1.6% of all people who try to take their lives. And so for me, I see that as a startling statistic because I work with quite a few transgender identified folks. I'm transgender identified myself. And it really makes a difference to think about that students who are part of this community are disproportionately affected by the rates of environmentally caused mental illness. So I say that why is it different than like a genetic or biological factor, is that these are oftentimes coping skills for being transgender in our society. And so this number is astonishing to me. And then also too, on the graphic on the right of my screen shows that, this person looking at these two different men's and women's restrooms and kind of shows in a comic kind of way this huge discrepancy in gendered spaces versus how things look in our society and how actually gender actually presents itself. And that there's this very real and applicable thing that those who self-identify as transgender are often the ones that have to put up with the most amounts of harassment and the most amounts of actually discrimination, regardless of just basic things like using a restroom. And I know lots of states now they kind of moved on from restroom talks so much. Now their states are looking at creating legislation and implementing legislation for trans girls in sports. But a few years ago, It was definitely everything on the front of people's minds was these so-called bathroom bills. So this idea that people had to use the restroom of what was on their birth certificate based on that. So, and, you know, there's been lots of situations where people are harassed or arrested or got, you know, security called on them just by using the restroom that makes them feel the most comfortable. So that for me, I think that's a major point of why do we need to talk about these identities, is this idea that it often comes down to just their basic existence of trans people. So like ensuring that trans people feel welcomed and accepted on our campus and that they have a place they can be themselves, then down to the everyday life of trans people just existing to try to like use the restroom or go to a locker room or go into a changing room, go into these places that are so highly gendered in our society already. And here's some more statistics from a similar study. And you can see that, you know, 80% of trans students felt unsafe in their school because of their gender expression. And that's a pretty pickable statistic to look at too for where we look. Working with our traditional age college students, our 18 to 24-year-old college students coming in from higher education, coming in from the K through 12 in the Idaho system in Washington and Oregon, and coming into our university system here, there are trauma involved with trying to be an out trans person in a space that is highly hostile to trans people. And I think it just depends on the situation and the schools they come from. But also too, I see kind of the reverse of that is that students who are 18 to 24-year-olds who are coming to campus tend to come out like they either, some of them are already out and like their parents are okay with it. And it's a spectrum with that. Then they're coming to the university and existing within that system as already established out transgender person, or those are the students who come out their first semester, even sometimes their first day, their first week here at the University of Idaho and having to navigate a newly started process of coming out while being a brand new student. So there's lots of spectrums of different identities that can fall within that. Also too, a big statistic is that transgender women, so those are women who are assigned male at birth, but either socially or medically or either or neither transition to be to self-identify as women. There's a one, and they are women, not just saying they're self-identified, but that's just how to describe it. They have a 1 in 12 chance of being murdered. And compared to that, trans women of color, so particularly Black identified trans women of color, have about a 1 in 8 chance of being murdered. And actually, I saw a statistic yesterday that said the average life expectancy of a Black identified trans person is 35. So for me, this just seems like a pandemic. This is like another pandemic. This is a pandemic of violence and discrimination against these individuals who deserve to have full lives without the fear of being themselves, without the fear of that if they're themselves, they might be murdered or they might be discriminated against. All right, pause for a second here. All right, to begin, I wanted to provide some foundational knowledge on how we determine how people self-identify. So on your screen, you can see this. I adapted the gender unicorn, if you're familiar with the gender unicorn. I adapted it to be a little more inclusive as time changes, information changes. So one of my work studies who was really great, they are an animal veterinary science member, and they created the gender goat for this usage. And so for the gender goat, this is a way we can visually represent like how gender and sexuality impact how we view ourselves. And so these are all culturally contingent, socially constructed ways that our society views gender and sexuality. And it's important to note that our sex assigned at birth and our gender identity and our sexual and romantic attraction are all separate things. I kind of like to use a sports reference, like they are all in the same league, but they are different teams in that league. So they may play each other, but they're never like on the same team. So it's just kind of important to differentiate between that, because I think in our society we have this knee-jerk reaction to intermingle gender and sex together like they're the same thing. Like My partner and I are expecting a child this summer, and we would get ultrasounds done and they label it gender, that this baby's physical body is their gender. And I'm like, no, actually that's their sex. That's not their gender. I don't say anything because it's like a 6-second thing. They like print out this little blurry gray image and give it to me. But like, I'm like, oh, that's a view of my child's genitals. That isn't a view of my child's gender, because my child's gender doesn't formulate until she's, till they're like, preschool age, kind of early kindergarten, preschool. So it's just interesting how those things are so conflated, even medically. So to start out then, our sex assigned at birth, that's how we are socially categorized in our society. And this is done through visual inspection upon our birth. And that's either done through being female or male, or there's intersex, or anything other form of biological diversity that may occur in our bodies just determines that. And that's about 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 2,000 births that individuals may be categorized chromosomally or physically or reproductive organs wise, hormonally, whatever that may be, they may be considered intersex. And intersex identity is always a vastly changing categorization of what is intersex versus what is not intersex and all that. And in the past has historically been more of a medicalized medicalized and pathologized. I can't say it. I can't write. I can write it, but I can't say the word. But that it's really seen as this like deficit that needs to be fixed on a small child. But in the last like 15 years or so, there's really been this push for allowing the children to choose later in life once they can conceptualize their gender identity versus their sex assigned at birth. And as long as it doesn't affect their physical function early on, to allow the person to choose what their bodies look like based on that diversity of different body types. So you think about sex assigned at birth as our foundational way that we view our sex assigned at birth in our society. That ends up to this blue line here. That's our gender expression. And that's how we show the world how we conceptualize gender. And that's a variant, individual, fluid thing that we all do together as people. So like, it's a socially constructed mean, because gender is a performance. We don't come out of the womb understanding what bodies mean. Heck, my 3.5-year-old is just starting to understand pronouns. Like those are new things for her. Like she's only been around women majority of her life, just in her life of how we are. She has 2 moms, and she's primarily go to childcare facilities that only have women employees. Like that's a primary thing. And so like she has a stuffed cat she carries around whose name is John, and she uses both male and female pronouns for John. John's gender changes on a hourly basis. We never know. We just kind of guess what John's gender is at that moment, what pronouns we use for John. But like that shows you too that this idea of masculinity and femininity aren't an innate thing. There's something that we learn through society. And Judith Butler way back in 1990, when she wrote Gender Trouble, really began that conversation with gender. Is like, gender is a performance. Gender is something that we do on a daily basis. And that the reality is that we have no conception, like internal, like without a social constructions of understanding of how gender, masculinity, and femininity, and our gender identity and gender expression works, there's no way we can understand it. And honestly, I would argue too, and Judith Butler does argue this in her paper, that in that book, that your sex assigned at birth also has no social categorization without this understanding of performativity of even your physical bodies. That our physical gender, our physical sex is also a performative thing that we learn because of this social construction. And so this femininity and masculinity, or anything else that's part of that, is really, all of us have masculine and feminine traits. None of us are, hyper masculine or hyper feminine. And honestly, this might be a value call, so take it with a grain of salt what I'm about to say, but hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity tends to be in those, for me, in those, then the moments where things get kind of really toxic in our society. Like this idea of like, obviously we talk about like toxic masculinity, but there's also toxic femininity. And there's like this idea that when we adhere to these really rigid gender roles, that it inhibits how we self-identify and how we all feel comfortable within this, and how our gender expression can be made up in these different ways that make up who we are. So like, you know, not everyone who has short hair is automatically masculine, and not everyone who has long hair is automatically feminine. That there's all these different ways that are the way we show our gender express how we feel about that. And there's lots of individuals, including myself, who consider myself that femininity and masculinity. I tend to be more masculine, but I tend to have both expressions about that. And I don't really adhere to one type of expression depending on that. So it just depends on the situation and the person. And the really cool thing is about these identities is that there's no correct combination of identities that you can learn. You don't have to. That's the really cool thing about it. Is like I try to remind folks is that you don't have to memorize all these different terms and all these different identities. The biggest thing we should do as good people is just take people's self-identity on face value. And so what I mean by face value is that you believe what they tell you and you believe how people identify. So if you meet someone who is assigned female at birth but identifies as a man, they're a man. Or vice versa, or they're non-binary and they identify as that. Or if you're cisgender, meaning your gender matches what you assigned to your birth, you are that person, that identity. It all just depends on that. And our gender identity then is how we conceptualize it. So we say sex is between your legs and gender is between your ears. So that's how we attribute these culturally created ways of how we view our gender into our culturally created understandings of what being a man is, what being a woman is, what being a non-binary person is, et cetera, depending on how people self-identify. And then finally, our sexual and romantic attraction then are separate than our gender identities. So lots of times there's no way to determine if someone is to come out and transition that are, change their gender in any way that they feel comfortable. What's going to determine happen to their sexual orientation or their romantic orientation. It all just depends on how people self-identify and what's happening with them. But I think in the past, we've had these stereotypes that trans people are just trying to look for reasons to be attracted to their same sex assigned at birth, but they transition in order to make that more socially acceptable for them, which makes no sense logically based on how we see how trans people are treated in our society. But there is that old assumption. But reality is that these things are not interconnected in the slightest. Do y'all have any questions? I just talked a lot, and sometimes I kind of go off and I forget what I say. So hopefully it made sense.
I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Going back to your goat real quick, can you go back a slide?
Yeah.
And I'm just going to reveal my ignorance here. When you say trans, which category presented here does it fall?
Like for trans identity?
Mm-hmm. Is that a gender identity? Is that a gender expression? Like which of these categories are that?
It could be a gender identity and it could be a gender expression, just depending on the person. It really just depends, because the basic, I'm just going to do the next slide actually has a definition for transgender, but the basic definition of being transgender is it's any individual whose gender identity or expression is different than what's assigned to them at birth. So for me, I consider myself to be transgender, even though I'm not transitioning and I still use my gender assigned pronouns that was given to me at birth. And I still use my name that was given to me at birth, but I still consider myself transgender because non-binary, particularly because my gender expression is different than what was assigned to me at my birth. But some people may transition and their gender identity is different also. So they go by different names or pronouns, or gender identities is different. It's so highly individual too. So I hope that helped answer your question.
It did.
Cool. So transgender is an interesting term because it's both an umbrella statement. So it's an umbrella terminology that describes like an entire community, but it's also an individual identity too that people can self-identify as. And if you're not sure what people self-identify as, if it's something that's applicable, like if you're going to talk to somebody for longer than like 30 seconds and it's, reasonable for you to ask them these questions, you can always ask people, how do they identify? Like, what are their identities and what are their, things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about etiquette and working with trans folks a necessity for a definition. So trans identity is not a label we give people. Trans identity is a label that people give themselves. And it's our jobs to job to be inclusive and kind and use those identities that people self-identify with for first and foremost. And I think that's where our society in general tends to get uncomfortable, because as psychologically we're as humans, I think we are comforted by categorizations, and we're comforted by this understanding of like, this is a man, this is a woman, just like how I think of the same things like this is a chair and this is a table. But the reality is that even with like non-human categorizations of things, there's lots of different definitions of like what's a couch, what's a chair, what's a table. There's all these different ways that people can, these furniture can look. And I'm not trying to equate trans people to like identities, but I'm trying to do, it sounds bad, like I'm like, it could be a Barco lounger or a recliner, like who knows. But like no, but like the reality is that I think it's that similar kind of mindset to where there's all different flavors of human diversity when it comes to gender identity, and trans identities is one part of that. But it's our job as good people to allow those people to self-identify solely. And that's like the easiest and cheapest and like less time consuming thing you can do, is just allow people to self-identify with you. Okay, cool. We're gonna watch a quick video. So just give me 1 second while I change over my screens. And I have the captions on, and I apologize. These are captions generated automatically on YouTube. So sometimes they're a gamble to what you're gonna get, if they make any sense. So please speak up right away if you can't hear this. You'll have to like unmute yourself because the chat sometimes doesn't show up. But we should be able to see it pretty well.
My name is Rose. I'm a transgender girl. I was born a boy, but I always knew that I was a girl.
My name is Devon. I'm a trans male. That means I was born female, and I live now as a male. When I was 3, I decided that I was going to grow up and be a father and marry Janet Jackson.
She would write letters to Santa Claus, to the Tooth Fairy. When would I be turned into a girl? Could you turn me into a girl?
I'm Jay. I'm a non-binary trans person. That means that I'm not a man, nor am I a woman. I was raised as a girl, but when I learned about non-binary gender identities, it was like a whole new world had opened up for me.
My name is Ronnie, and my sister Ellie is transgender.
Ellie told us on her 4th birthday that she was a girl in her heart and her brain. And I said, "You're my favorite princess boy." And what did you say, Ellie?
No, I'm a princess girl.
My struggling point was this had to be a phase.
The reality is acceptance takes a while.
I was terrified of coming out. I was afraid of losing friends, family, loved ones. I was afraid of this discrimination and potential violence I could face.
I was so terrified that I wanted to die. Got threatening letters. One of the quotes said, do us a favor, Paula, and put that gun back up to your head and finish the job.
I'm scared as a dad for her safety, whether society will be as accepting as her family and her friends are.
I feel embarrassed and unsafe when people out me to other people.
If there isn't a gender-neutral bathroom available, when there are only men's and women's bathrooms, I have to make a decision about how I look that day and whether there's more risk for me going into the men's room or the women's room.
I was chased by 4 people in the metro for being transgender.
I have been denied health care. I have been gawked at. I've been humiliated. I have been physically assaulted several times when using a bathroom.
Seeing her face the first time we let her wear a dress outside of the house. Pretty special.
You're different, that's okay. Just keep on being yourself.
Support means listening. Maybe not understanding, but just listening and being there for me.
Pushing back on jokes or offensive comments at the expense of transgender people.
The easiest way to support transgender people is to follow their lead.
Supporting transgender people means letting them be who they are.
I'm proud to be trans because I want to be myself.
I'm proud to be trans because I think life is too short to be anything besides what you are. This is who I am.
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 I like to show that video because I think it's important that we hear a little bit from the actual experiences. And normally in a non-pandemic year, I would get a group of trans students together to have them come talk about their experiences on campus as part of this training. But with it being finals week and we're doing a lot of things over Zoom, I just kind of gave up on the trying to get students to show up to things a while back. But if you're ever interested in hearing more from the experiences of trans students on our campus, that's something else I can arrange on a different day. I have a panel, we have a Speakers Bureau panel, which is led by student volunteers and myself. We go into classrooms and organizations and tell their coming out stories and answer questions. So that's always an option too, if you're interested in learning more. As you can tell, there's a large variety of ways that people can self-identify as transgender, and it just depends on the person and their self-identification. But like the folks say in the video, it's important that they just follow their lead, let them be themselves, and be accepting, even if you don't understand it. Because sometimes it's going to be hard to understand, but it's just a learning process in its general. So then transition then is really the process of changing your gender expression or identity through social and medical ways in order to match the expression, match your gender expression to the person's gender identity. So really the reality is that's just kind of the social and medical ways and or medical ways that people can do to transition to make themselves feel more comfortable in themselves and how they self-identify. And it's really matching those socially constructed and socially identified ways that people identify their gender identity. So this can involve changing your names, your pronouns. That's most of the time you're gonna the most interaction we're gonna have with trans people is gonna be with that. We're usually not gonna have any interactions with the medical side of it, hopefully not. But that it's mostly going to be these social ways that we interact with students on our campus. More terminology then. I'm just going to go through some terminology, and then we'll kind of get into some barriers, and then we'll get into the best practices. So AFAB or AMAB are ways to describe people who are assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. And really it's just a way to describe your sex assigned at birth rather than confusing it with your gender identity. So it's like this change of oh, this person was assigned female at birth, this person was assigned male at birth. And it's a much more prevalent way of saying that now than just this old adage of they are a man, as a woman in a man's body, that kind of adage for trans women, there's a woman inside of my body this whole time. There could have been, but the reality is that we want to move away from those binary ways of looking at things, that rather than these were social definitions of somebody. And then for me, trans people in my mind are always trans. There's never been a time when they're not been trans. It's just when people are out or not, or when they come out to you or not, there's never that kind of that old narrative is not so popular anymore. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but that intersex then is those variations of physical sex and chromosome gonads and genitals that do not allow individuals to be distinctly identified as male or female. And that's the different thing too, is that with intersex identities is that you can still have someone who identifies as transgender, but also intersex, because gender identity and our sex assigned at birth are separate things. So they're not like, it's kind of like, again, that umbrella term that kind of encompasses all these different identities, but it's kind of its own way whatsoever. And if you have any more like technical questions about that, I would suggest Googling it or asking a doctor, because I do not know. You get the very first paragraph Wikipedia definition from me. Some more gender terminology. So those who are gender nonconforming, which I feel like now is becoming more of an outdated term, but those are people whose gender identity and expression does not match the stereotypes that follow their sex assigned at birth. And you have non-binary folks. Genderqueer is definitely more of an outdated term now. I think more. The majority of the students I work with currently, these younger 18 to 24-year-olds, tend to identify either as trans, transgender, or non-binary. I don't really hear too much of other identities as part of that. That's someone who may not identify as a man or a woman, as that person said in the video, just depending on the situation. Non-binary folks may physically or medically or socially transition. They may use they, them pronouns. They may go by different that, or they're like, they could not, just depending on the situation. And there's really no one way that someone could be non-binary. So just kind of treat each non-binary person on an individual basis on how they self-identify. But the basic thing is that for non-binary folks, it's just understanding that these like, using terminology that links people together based on this assigned sex at birth is not as categorized as could be. Like walking into a room and there's a non-binary person there, you assume they're all female, assigned female birth. You don't walk in and say ladies, that kind of thing. Like you say like everybody or folks or whatever, just to be as inclusive of that. We'll talk more about gender neutral language. And then cisgender, those are people whose gender identity and expression matches what's assigned to them at birth. So that's just a different way of saying cis, meaning same. So same gender assigned at birth, and trans meaning across, meaning different gender that's assigned to a birth. And before cisgender came out, folks were just like, oh, you got everyone else and then transgender people. And then we're like, wait, no. Yes, I definitely can send out the slides to someone, and then they can distribute them out to you all if you're interested in getting the slides. But really, it's just depends on how people self-identify that makes up what's assigned to them at birth. So you might hear students or people talk about like cis people, CIS people. That's the term, or cis-het, meaning cisgender heterosexual folks. Kind of as the community of non-queer, non-transgender folks. Yes, I will do that. So this is kind of like where I like to give the most explanation in this training, and please feel free to, if you have any questions or comments, to please keep them coming. I like responding to questions and comments. But some social impacts that come from being transgender in our society. And I think that's one of the bigger ways. Like there's institutional and infrastructure ways that we tend to, trans people will have some issues with. But when working with our like college age student populations that I work with closely, I tend to see these social implications. And honestly, faculty and staff can still have these social implications too, because it's not, and our grad students, which are kind of a unique group of students, because they're both students, but they're also, older and professional staff, older and staff, graduate assistants and teaching assistants and research assistants. So there's lots of different ways that socially these things can be more difficult to participate in. A big thing is, I talked about this a little before, is this idea of bathrooms and access to these gender inclusive restrooms. And the list is ever expanding, because whenever I talk about it to people, we always have we always have more people being like, oh, what about this restroom? But we have around, I'd say 15 or 16 so far that I know of, gender inclusive restrooms around. And I did update the list recently, but I tried it on the LGBTQ office website. There is a list of and a map of gender inclusive restrooms on our campus. And I try to update them yearly. I just haven't done it because of the pandemic recently, because I worry about my poor work studies having to go out and find all these restrooms and keep them more enclosed in their safe social distance bubble. But we'll be updating the list soon, but that's also something if anyone's interested in. And really what we're looking for are those restrooms that have this single door locking, one toilet, one sink inside of them. There are some campuses, like I think WSU may have a few of them that I've seen, but other campuses that have like the gender, like gender neutral or gender inclusive restrooms of like group bathrooms. So with stalls, yeah, it doesn't have stick figures on the door. That's a challenge. Get those stick figures off the door. But they do have like different restrooms, and they have signs that just have a toilet on there. It's just like toilet, that's all it says, rather than like restroom. But there's also other campuses around the country that have those like group bathrooms. I've been in places like conferences and things where they open up group restrooms. So you can go into a restroom and it says it has a urinal versus has toilets. So they don't differentiate based on like, is it a men's room or a women's room? It's just there's urinals there or there's not urinals in that room. And you can use those rooms accordingly. It just depends on the situation. But right now, the majority, all of our gender inclusive bathrooms on our campus are those single occupancy locking doors with a toilet and a sink in them, no stalls. But this comes as an issue because like it can be as hard as we've had situations where students that want to live in the tower, which is our primarily traditional residence halls. And we encourage our students to live in the Wallace residence halls for housing because they are suites. So you have, for our first year live-on students, we have those three, our first year or our live-on students, you have 3 roommates, 2 per room, and you share a joint bathroom with folks. You can have, we have gender inclusive housing within those restrooms situations. But like in the tower, there's not those restrooms. There are male and female restrooms on each floor, depending on which floor they want to live on. And so those comes to those complications too of how do students interact within these spaces in their residence halls where they have these joint group restrooms or other situations that do arise when it comes to having these spaces. So that's where things can get complicated, is how do we create these spaces for that? And definitely too, like pro signage and this signage that it doesn't have just male and female figures on them is also important. But I think it just depends on the campus and the situation too. Another social thing that we talk about, because I primarily work with undergraduate students, so I think a lot about this is their social lives. And we got to think about too, is like dating and social interactions can be really hard. I know sometimes it's less about like important to think about like these social implications, but when we think about our students and their holistic well-being of themselves on our campus, we're also thinking about their whole being. And so that whole being also includes like these social interactions, these dating situations, these friendship situations where it can be really hard for folks to be comfortable. And we have gender inclusive name changes now within our system that occurred at the beginning of this semester. And so that helps a lot with these social awkwardness and the social uncomfortability because the students don't have to out themselves to the professors every semester now. But we still have these situations that arise where, should you disclose? Should you tell people your identities? Like, are you going to be, will you be read as transgender versus not? Like, are you going to be seen as a cis person based on that gender identity that you want to be read as, or that you don't want to be read as? Because we also talk about too, like this idea of like trans people not being recognized as being trans, as just being, we think is their sex assigned at birth, and not honoring their identities. So it could be complicated, especially socially, because gender makes up a lot of how we view the world, and it makes up our language, and it makes up how we view each other socially too. So that can be really hard. And when you think about it from a younger person's standpoint, you're just figuring out how to come out. You also like dealing with like being in school, coming out, and trying to navigate systems, a system that both socially and emotionally is not set up for people who are transgender too. So it can make things kind of difficult. Which relates then to disclosure and coming out. Do people need to come out? I know with like the name changes, there is some concerns because legally we cannot change names that deal with like your paychecks, checks, financial aid, anything that's tied to like a larger account that is done based on your legal name or your dead name. This idea of a name that was assigned to them at birth, the dead name, can be difficult to do because like if we have students to employees and they go by one name, but like they have to fill out a W-2 and you get your timesheets and all that stuff has to be listed under that legal name or that dead name for them. That can be really hard for folks with this disclosure and coming out. And we've eliminated a lot of these barriers before with having the name changes. So like on Vandal Web and your student rosters and our housing rosters and all these different ways that we view, down to the library, down to like their Vandal card, all these different like technological and business functionings we have in our campus. There's still certain aspects that you can't do that. And changing your name in Idaho is surprisingly complicated and expensive. It's not like a simple, like I go to the DMV and I can get my name changed in an afternoon. In Idaho, you still have to, you got to go file some paperwork with your name change. You have to have letters saying that you are wanting to change your name, and this is why. I think they still require informed consent here in the state of Idaho. And then once you do that, you have to list your name change in a public newspaper for 1 week in the classified notices section. So once that week is up and no one has come after you for fraud or something, I don't know, make sure you're not skirting your debts or from society, I don't know, whatever. And then you go back to court, then the judge can approve your name change. And then you have to go down to the Social Security office or go up to the Social Security office of Spokane or Lewiston to get your Social Security number changed, your Social Security card changed. So all these different things are really hard to do. They got to go to the DMV. And I know I've heard both good and bad things about the Latah County DMV around here about people being supportive or not. So it just depends on the situation. You got to have a clerk or a judge who's going to be okay with you changing your name. You got to have the money to put your name in the newspaper. It's about $350 all in for getting a name change. And then you have to have the access to transportation to go to court, go to the Social Security office, go to all these places. And if you do need letters from a mental health provider saying that you've thought about these situations, it's usually like 6 sessions or maybe even more of like psychological assessment to see if you're ready to actually start any sort of transition related things or change your name. That can be incredibly complicated. And so if you are a 20-year-old or even myself, like I don't even think I could come up with, like it'd take me a while to come up with all those resources to be able to go out and change my name or to change my gender marker and my identification or to do that, compared to like Washington or Oregon, where I know I'm not sure about Washington, but Oregon, you can go and get an X on your gender marker and be non-binary, and it's a lot easier process. Or I've had students from California say they're just going to wait till they go back down to California to change their name because it's so much simpler, a lot less red tape down there. So it just depends on the situation. Also too, disclosure and coming out can be dangerous, or could cost people friendships or relationships. I know I always want to think like, no, you wouldn't be around that person if they came out, they would be okay with it. But there's lots of situations where, there are difficult things. And also too, the media that surrounds trans people, so we're like learning about coming out, oftentimes these coming out processes can be really dangerous. If you think of like the history of film and like Boys Don't Cry. So when Brandon Teena came out in Nebraska in like the 90s, he was murdered when they found out he was trans, or there's so many different situations that may arise. Sorry.
You just muted yourself.
Oh, thank you. I don't know how I did it. It's just my microphone has a button. So, but anyway, all these situations do arise that could be potentially dangerous for folks. And then marginalization that comes with being out and being a part of a community that is continuously marginalized. And like the recent House bill in Idaho that said that, you know, if to perform in women's and girls sports, you have to have a visual inspection of bodies to ensure that you are biologically assigned female. It's not just that that this situation does arise and it has issues with the courts and issues with NCAA for us in higher education and issues of, you know, basic human rights, but it's also an issue of too, is that these laws and these types of things are continuous marginalizations of a community that say like, oh, well, maybe I'm not welcomed in the state of Idaho, or maybe I'm not welcomed in this town or this community because they're willing to pass a law that says that, like, you know, a trans girl can't play sports, or, you know, there's no protections for me, or that, and that affects things. That affects like retention of people staying in Idaho that want to stay after college or even during college. They want to go to a different place that's a little more welcoming of their identities, but also too that happens with recruiting new students, new employees, new people to our area because they hear about these stories and that the potential for marginalization and discrimination can occur, and it makes it really hard for people to feel like they can come and be open and out about themselves when there's other places that they could be. Another concern is medical, and this is a whole other, like, I'm literally doing a training about this tomorrow for our medical students, our WAMI program, but that there is just a whole other group of challenges when it comes to medical concerns for transgender individuals. One is finding a doctor that's comfortable with treating a trans person. I've heard stories from students that talk about like going to the student health center and the doctors being really focused on if they're on hormone affirming therapy. So affirming hormone therapy. So like, you know, on testosterone or estrogen, and then they go in, they complain about a non-transition related concern. And then the doctors are like, well, what about your testosterone? How could that be affecting your stomach ache? And it's like, I don't think so. I think I got IBS, you know, those kinds of things. Like, or I had a student who was a trans woman, and she was telling me she went to the doctor because she had been having some stomach aches, some concerns, and they thought it was from her estrogen because she was a trans woman. And turns out she just like couldn't eat dairy, you know, like something very simple and very mundane. But then it becomes this hyper focus on their trans identity rather than the other medical causes that could be part of it. Or trans people, there's a whole thing of trans people who get pretty serious life-threatening illnesses and that are preventable because if they transition, they're linked as like male or female in medical systems, but they're not prepared for them to need medical procedures that are done for like the opposite gender that they are, the opposite sex that they presume to be. So like trans men need, you know, exams like exams looking for screenings like cervical and ovarian and uterine cancer, or trans women need prostate cancer exams or breast cancer exams, depending on the situation. Like all these things can arise when there's no state about this. But for the students I work with, the primary medical concerns then are primarily where can they access affirmative transgender healthcare that is covered under their insurance and that they're treated respectfully. And unfortunately, we have not found all three of those things here on campus. The Student Health Center does not start or maintain student transition medical concerns. So like going on hormone affirmative therapies or doing any of those things. The student health insurance SHIP does not cover those types of things. They won't cover the initial appointments. They will cover the prescription drugs. So you can get testosterone and estrogen for cheaper, but they don't, for the students who have to go get blood tests done, that's all out of pocket. And doctor visits and medical labs out of pocket are very expensive. And there's just other concerns that come with the, you know, potential for going to a space and not getting, you know, into an emergency situation, not getting medical care, et cetera, et cetera. It just depends on the situation and where the students are at and what's happening to them. But then the most frustrating part of this all is that a lot of times with trans medical care on our campus and the student health insurance and all other things, it's so individual. So I'll hear one student who says that they can't find healthcare, so they go to Planned Parenthood over in Pullman. But then I hear another student like down in Boise who was like, oh, I had no problem going to a primary care provider and finding someone who will start my hormone therapy for me and is covered under my insurance. So it's so variant. There's no one way of looking at it. Also too, when you think about our students and where they're at in their, you know, I run into a lot of students who are trying to go over to Planned Parenthood over in Pullman to start their affirmative therapies, and then they don't have a car. So how do they get over back and forth? Because at first you got to go. It's a pretty long appointment with the labs and blood work. I know that because before I got told by my supervisor I'm not allowed to do that, I would give people rides. And it was like a couple of hours of sitting in my car in a parking lot, but worth it. But then I was told it's a liability, so I can't do it anymore. But but there's also this concern too, then you have to go back every week or months and stuff to get your blood monitored, and it's kind of time consuming if you don't drive. There's also legal issues. We talked about that a little bit with identification, changing your name, but there's also housing and employment discrimination that still occur. In the state of Idaho, statewide civil rights protections don't cover sexual orientation or gender identity and expression. We have them here on the campus. The city of Moscow has one, but I am not quite sure how much that covers. From my understanding, that's mostly with like citywide discrimination. So if I would be discriminated against in Troy, it wouldn't matter, but I'm discriminated against here, I might be able to file a claim with the city. But housing discrimination and employment discrimination is extremely hard to prove. With housing discrimination, the only way you can get covered is if you prove it through sex discrimination, which is covered under basically like Title IX, which says like, you know, I was discriminated against based on my sex, but transgender identity is not about your sex, so then you can't prove that a lot. So for our folks that run into situations where they can't get a job or can't get access to affordable and equal housing, it can be a concern. And I've worked with the Idaho Legal Aid Clinic down in Lewiston to provide trainings for students, and that's kind of the majority of what they say is you just got to try to prove sex discrimination for federally. But statewide, there's no way you can prove that because we don't have equal access to protections like other states around us. And then immigration's its own thing. I can't even try to, but try to understand kind of what's happening legally with that right now, but that's also a concern that people have. We'll let you collect your thoughts for a second while I take a drink of water, but please feel free to, if you have any questions or comments or anything, please. All right, so now we're going to do some etiquette. And so this is just going to be some best tips, easy tips and tricks on how to be inclusive of people. I know that seems kind of like a duh statement, like how do you be nice to people? But unfortunately, a lot of times we have to talk to people about this. The biggest thing you can do, the easiest thing you can do is allow people to self-identify their names and pronouns. And some of the easiest ways that can be done is if like you're working in a lab or teaching a class, is in those first few days of class or labs, or even just if you have access to email lists ahead of time, it's sending those emails being like, hi, my name is so-and-so. I use these pronouns and we're going to start work together, or we're in a new class together. If you have a different name or pronoun you would like me to use, please feel free to reply or send me an email or drop me a comment or stop by my office and we can talk about it further. And that's what you can do. Now with the name changes being in like our BB Learn and our Vandal web systems, there'll be less of a concern about like online postings if you're teaching courses. But the easiest way is that when you introduce yourself, to say your names and pronouns every time. And it's not just a concern for people who use different pronouns, is that if you do these introductions with your names and pronouns all the time, it becomes part of your vernacular. Like, I introduce myself, my names and pronouns continuously, all the time. Doesn't matter what I do. I'm always Julia, she, her pronouns. And so it became part of my like introductions I do for folks professionally. And it's okay to ask people their names and pronouns, because that's like the number one question I get asked from folks is like, I don't want to offend anyone. Is it okay if I ask them their pronouns and they're offended? There could be situations where people may not want to talk about their pronouns or may not want to share, but that's up to them. That's individual. If they're not comfortable sharing their pronouns, they're going to tell you a pronoun they're comfortable hearing in public versus private. If someone comes out to you and they're using a different name and pronoun, I always ask, what names would you like me to use in public versus what name would you like me to use in private? To respect that privacy and sometimes they're like, oh, I don't care about this or use this name or whatever. It just depends on the situation. So it's always important to, if you're going to talk to someone, you know, I don't ask my baristas their names and pronouns. But like, I know my names and pronouns of my barber, you know, like those are different things. Like I interact with my barber a lot more than I would interact with a Starbucks employee going through the drive-through line. Or I knew the names and pronouns. Like I had a work study that came out midway through the year and changed our names and pronouns. And we don't have a big office. There's only 4 of us here, but like we were right away like, okay, this is the name and pronoun. And we changed everything on all the like forms. I used a marker and crossed out their dead name and used their real name on all of their information. They informed everybody. It was easy peasy done. And that's all you got to do. You just got to make sure. So like when you're doing introductions, you can walk around and say, hi, my name is so-and-so. I use these pronouns, or hi, you know, whatever you may be. It's just really allowing people to self-identify. And some people don't know. They're like, she, he. And that's a great learning opportunity too, because then it gets them thinking about gender and gender identity and gender expression and pronouns that they normally wouldn't think about, because that's privilege. When you don't have to think about your names and pronouns and being respected, and that you can walk into a room and everyone's going to be able to tell if, you know, what pronouns you use based on what you are, based on how you identify, that's privilege. And so it's important to kind of acknowledge that and understand that when we're treating these best practices for people, we're creating spaces for them to be able to self-identify openly. If you have any questions or have situations and you want to talk to me offline about it, please feel free to send me an email or call my office or whatever. I'm going to give you my contact information to this presentation, and we can have a more detailed conversation. I love talking about this stuff. Big thing is too, don't ask people invasive questions. I know this seems like, duh. Yeah, I wouldn't ask people about their medical information or surgeries, but people love to ask trans people about their bodies. Or other invasive questions are like, what was your name? What was your name? What was your legal name at birth? That's none of your business. Or I'd love to see a baby photo of you. Do you have a baby photo? Who asks people they got baby photos? Like, who walks around being like a cisgendered person, like, you know what I would love to see? You as a baby. That's creepy. But people ask these because it's that curiosity. I kind of see it in the same, yeah, but what were you assigned at birth? Like, what was your, like, no. Like, do you want to see my birth certificate? Like, is that what you want to see? Like, should I show you my paperwork? Like, no, like it's that idea that trans people, that this curiosity assumes that trans people are not people with full rights to privacy and anonymity and respect of their personal stories and what they self-identify as. And, you know, always the stories that, did you have the surgery yet? Like, I always joke to say, if someone ever asked me if I had this surgery, I'd say, yes, I did have my tonsils removed in 1991. I was in 1st grade and I got to stay home from school for a week and it was great. Like, what surgery are you talking about? Like, no, they're asking about is like, what does your body mean? And so unless you're like a doctor, medical provider, you're in a romantic relationship with somebody and you need to know about their body parts, and you're in that, you both consent to talking about that, or if there's like some terrible emergency and you need to fill out their their medical history, then you may need to know about that kinds of stuff. But there's very few instances where you need to ask these questions, but people do, and they feel like they have the right to do it. And unless that trans person is willing and open to share about their identities, they should be able to do it, but most of the times they're not. So just don't ask. Another big thing is outing. Outing can be dangerous. That when we out people, we are basically, one, sharing news about them that we are not allowed to share. That's like telling somebody's secret. My daughter has books about not sharing people's secrets. It's called Olive and the Big Secret. She loved it when she was a little younger. We read that book all the time. And like this idea of like, you know, it's important to keep these things to ourselves, but also too, like when we're interacting, we're advocating for students, like especially with name changes and legal names versus actual names, or as the campus calls them, preferred names, which I don't like. They're not preferred, it's their name. But anyway, that we need to advocate for people across campus. It's important that we check with individuals before we advocate for them. So like if I'm like, I have a group of students that signed some paperwork at the beginning of the year because they're my advisees. And so like they basically give me permission to like advocate for them across campus. So like if I need to call financial aid for a student, I don't need to like, I always check with them anyway, but like I have that kind of like that permission already, like a permission slip. But when I advocate for students, I always ask, what name would you like me to use when I call this different office? Unless they've had a legal name change. But most of the time, if they've had a legal name change, they're not usually running into these, sometimes those concerns aren't going to be there. So I kind of know they're going to use that name. But I'm never going to out somebody. I'm never going to be like, you know, go talk to a professor and be like, well, they're trans. That's what, you know, I'm never going to say that unless it's like an emergency, an applicable situation. I have permission from that student to talk about it. So it's important not to out individuals and not to assume that people are out. So even if you know they're trans and then like they're out, but maybe they've only been out the whole time you've known them in their role or in their time on campus, it's important not to be like, well, you know, they're trans, right? Because that's just gossiping. That's just not good professional behaviors. And we need to keep that information to ourselves. I also, if I know a student's non-binary and they may use different pronouns, I always, or anyone in general, if they have like a different first name than, or pronouns than what they use, I also ask students about their like letters of recommendation. What pronouns would they like me to use in their letters of recommendation? Because I wrote a letter of recommendation last summer for a non-binary student, and I was like, would you like me to use they, them, or the pronouns you would assume, people would assume you would use? And they asked for they, them. So it's just, sometimes those simple questions are just the easiest. And statistically, you're more likely not to have to deal with this than you are. But being prepared in advance is more important than just assuming that this will never happen. It's that pre-knowledge that's there. And then finally, not assuming everyone is going to transition or they're going to take social or medical ways to change their body about that. And I think that's important to note too, is that this transition thing is a highly individualized and personal thing. And I know there's like a narrative in our society about trans people that we tend to see in the media, if we do see trans people in the media, but the reality is that it's not for everyone. Not everyone has the same ways to self-identify versus others. And so I think it just depends on the situation and how people are self-identifying. So it's just important to remember that when you're working with folks who are trans, is that you respect where they're at in their journeys and understand too that some people, you know, I've had students who change their names frequently. Like I have a student who was a first year and they couldn't make it to an event, and literally their friends, they were kind of like just mentioning them, were using 2 different names for them. And I got confused at first because I didn't know they changed their name, but like I caught on eventually and I was like respectful of it. And I was like, oh, is it so-and-so? Like, oh yeah, that's the name they're trying out right now. I'm like, okay, cool. They're trying out a name, they can try out a name. That's fine. I don't mind. But it's just those things of like being respectful of that and being respectful of supporting them in however way they need. And the best way you can find out if you're working closely with a person who's trans and they need your support is ask them. Like, hey, I'm really excited you said that you're trans and I really want to support you in any way you can. So what's the best way I can do to support you in our department? And they'll tell you. Or they may not know and you say, cool, well, I'm just here to listen if you ever need an ear to listen to. Or like in the video when they talked about like stopping offensive jokes or offensive language, it's providing that support. Being aware of like, not being proactive in your inclusion, not just doing it when people are in your class and you need to do it, or they're in your lab and you need to do it. You do it for everyone in advance, having those civility clauses in your syllabus, or having a little note in your lab guide. I don't know how you all work, but like whatever you do in your work, to have these like where you share public information like, hey, we respect everyone based on their identity that they tell us. And so we'll be respectful and use appropriate language and follow the University of Idaho's non-discrimination policy. Things like that can help you with that. Do you have any questions? Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Brianna had a good point about like non-binary people on like for them, like becoming a man, like a bus stop. Not everyone's going to do whatever. People are going to do what they want to do. And it's important to respect that self-identity. That's a really good point. Thank you. Cool. We're going to watch one quick video, and this is going to be about supporting trans folks in the classrooms and around campus.
Not every trans person is the same, and not every trans person looks the same. When we represent trans people, we want to show every beautiful part of our community.
In my school, we seem to have a problem where administration is only listening to the struggles of white trans students, and it is not listening to the struggles of trans students of color. And I cannot stress enough that it is important to identify the intersections between class and race and gender identity, and listen to the voices that are often being marginalized and erased within your school community and the entire country.
Personally, I've had experiences where teachers assume that their classroom is full of heterosexual cisgender students, and that speaking about LGBT people is some sort of other or some hypothetical situation.
I think a big thing is just kind of weeding in representation wherever you can. For example, like if you're teaching math class, you can have problem, instead of saying Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you can throw in some diversity and say Mr. and Mr. Smith, or Mrs. and Mrs. Smith, or even use a gender neutral term. So that's a big thing, just fitting in diversity wherever you can. I really believe that schools need to be open to listening to the voices of trans students of color within your schools and hearing what they need, because everyone is going to need something different, and the most important thing is to listen and hear these stories, hear these experiences, and hear what these people need.
An all-gender bathroom is basically like a big sign to all LGBT students that differences are accepted. All-gender bathrooms don't exist just to accommodate trans people either. That's a misbelief. All-gender bathrooms are encouraging everybody is treated the same and not grouped according to how you may look or how you may express yourself. So if I see an all-gender bathroom, I immediately know that I'm accepted and that I'm in a safe place. And again, if you're at school, you need that safe place to be able to learn and to grow and to develop socially.
Mostly so I get the video down right away so you don't see all my YouTube recommendations. Embarrassing. No. I don't have any embarrassing YouTube recommendations. But yeah, I think it's important that, you know, with the video, it just tells us too that like, it's just listening to these students' concern and providing those spaces for them to talk about it. And it's a hard balance because you don't want to out people. You don't want to like, you know, turn to the one non-binary or trans person in your classrooms and be like, how do you feel about this? But I think it's just that extra checking in and that extra talking to folks and ensuring that they feel like they can talk about those concerns and they can have these conversations in their classrooms. And I think too, sometimes it's like, well, I work in this field. Like we're not talking about, you know, people, we're not talking about like diversity per se in this field, but diversity has come up. We don't live in a vacuum where we're like, okay, everybody come to the classroom. It's time to do chemistry. And we're only talking about chemistry. Like I want us to talk about Bunsen burners and rocks, whatever, you know, oxygen. I don't know what you all talk about in chemistry class, but that like, it's just to know that too, that like some of the stuff I hear from my queer and trans students is not so much about like the class material that sometimes makes them uncomfortable. It's the conversations before class. It's the conversations after class. It's the conversations amongst group members, amongst things that's when things get uncomfortable for them. That's when things like the climate can get uncomfortable. And it's the policies and procedures in place that can make people feel like they're not welcomed because they have to adhere to this gendered basis. And like understanding too that to try to be as inclusive as possible. When I was a undergraduate student, I was in the psychology of evolutionary psychology class because I was a psychology major. And I went to my professor once and I asked him, I'm like, what would evolutionary psychologists say about being gay? And he said, it's a warm up to heterosexuality. And I was like, seriously, a warm up to heterosexuality. But that was the answer he gave me. And I still think about it to this day because I'm like, there's so many different answers he could have said. Like, I don't know, like, let me find some resources for you. Let me look at some other scholarly work or some websites that talk about this instead of giving me this blunt and honestly kind of uncomfortable answer because he had never talked about the material in the class. So there's lots of things. It's just thinking about that, that holistic view of treating everyone as their whole beings, not just one part of themselves, and not just focusing on their gender identity when someone comes out like, you know, we have everyone in the lab and then the trans person. Like that's not how we want to view folks. We want to view them as open and hopefully supported people in our communities. So that's all I got for you right now. If you have any questions or comments, we're ending kind of early, so you can definitely fill in or ask me some questions if you have any. Here's my contact information. Any sort of communication to the LGBTQA office gets to me because I am the only staff member in this office. So if you send to either to my personal email or lgbtoffice@uidaho.edu, all those email addresses only go to me. I'm the only one that sees it. So if you have any questions, I'm more than willing to chat on the phone or to chat over Zoom or through email. Whatever you may want to do, you can stop by too, and we can have a conversation. Cool. Do y'all have any questions or comments? And I'll make sure to get you the PowerPoint too. I will send it out today.
Thanks, Julia. I will send the PowerPoints out on the IBEST listserv for sure, as well as directly to BCB students and faculty. I guess write in the comments if you'd like it emailed to another listserv that I'm unaware of.
So I actually have a question. Thank you. That talk was very informative. So in some like workshops or classes, I've seen that some professors like to start off by asking like, hey, if you want to share, or like sharing pronouns of everybody involved. But like you said, sometimes transgender students might not necessarily want to out themselves to the classroom. per se. So while on the one side, you could be providing a space for them to start off by sharing that, you could also be putting them in a situation where you are like making them either come out when they're not ready or conform to something that they're not really identifying with. So what do you think is the best policy to kind of navigate that space?
You can just say, we can go around the room and share our pronouns if you would like to share your pronoun.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've had people who've done that and then they just don't say anything. They say, hi, my name is Julia, and then they move on to the next person.
Okay, thank you.
And then if they're like uncomfortable by it, you can always pull them. If they could tell they're uncomfortable, you can always pull them aside and be like, hey, I noticed when we shared our pronouns, you seemed really uncomfortable. Like, I'm always here to chat if you need to talk to somebody, or like I'm here to provide you with any help you may need. Because we never want to call anyone out, but we also don't want to ignore if someone looks physically uncomfortable, and just have a conversation with them later to the side. But like, I don't know, maybe I can't speak for all trans people or all people in general, but if someone has the foresight to like ask me a question and check on me, that's half the battle of that inclusion. Even, you know, from my experience, it's usually not the people who are actively discriminated against with me usually don't care about my comfortability. Also, if you would like, usually when I do this training through employee development and learning, I have a little like sticker. It's about that big-ish. It says, I'm a transgender safe space. If you would like that sticker, please send me an email on the contact information. I'll put my email in here too, and I can send you out a sticker over campus mail if you would like. I'm just not going to send them out to everybody just because I don't know all your contact information. So if you would like one of those, I'm more than willing to give it to you. It's supposed to go and correspond with your Safe Zone placard, which is another training I offer. Oh, cool.
Any other questions? Eric, go ahead and speak up, Eric.
Hi, my name's Eric. My pronouns are he, him. I am new to Idaho, primarily from Chicago land area, and was in Washington State for a while. But a question I'd like to ask, as a cisgender identifying individual, I think having a safe zone placard on my door is something that I take seriously. And I just wanted to ask is there any base level things that you recommend for someone like myself who you're still building competency and understanding on how to best support, but also you do want to be a genuinely supportive space? Yeah. So would you, I know you can't, I know we're jumping into what ifs here, which can go a lot of different ways, but would you have any guidance on that?
Well, the big thing is just educating yourself. Like if you haven't taken the Safe Zone training yet, which is kind of similar to this one, but I will have a couple offered this summer. I just haven't set the dates yet for that. It's a good reminder for me to do that. But also it's just educating yourself, watching YouTube videos, going to student programs in the fall once things open back up and we have events. So like learning about students' experiences, that's a big thing. Professionally, there's so much information out there about best practices for working with LGBTQA folks in higher education. There's lots of articles and quick little articles too, like not like scholarly journals, but also just like basic information, like, you know, diverse issues in inside higher education. Going to have some information about that. The Chronicle has some really good stuff about trans and queer folks in higher ed. All these different places for people to talk about it. But I think the big thing is just working this inclusion into your daily life. So having your names in your Zoom thing is a really awesome way, introducing your pronouns, putting little things up in your space. If you have people in your space, like little like indicators to show that you're part of a community, like rainbow flags or like little stickers or whatever, like all those things all make a difference. But there's really no one way to do it. It's just just educating yourself further in your field and what your field, lots of fields have information on how to be that, and just being kind to people too. That's a big thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.